I've done a lot of work for many years now on infectious diseases. And the reason I do that is because when you actually go talk with producers, and I also happen to be a veterinarian, then infectious diseases are a pretty common problem. And so what I'm here to talk with you about today is foot and mouth disease. So I'll start with this comment from a very famous humorist. And as you will guess, all humorists are really great observers of human behavior. And I want you to think about this for a minute, because what I want to do today, if I can, is challenge you to recognize, are you somebody who needs to get kicked in the butt before you're going to learn something, because it's the only way you learn? Or is it possible that you could actually look ahead about something and maybe develop some good judgment, maybe some alternative ways of doing things, just based on knowing a little bit more about how the system works? I hope it is the latter, okay? And I'll ask you some questions. These are the types of things that I want you to be thinking about. How much do you know about the likely impacts of a potential foot and mouth disease outbreak? How concerned are you about a foot and mouth disease outbreak? How well informed are you about the Secure Beef Supply Response Plan? And what actions have you or your organization taken to be prepared for a foot and mouth disease outbreak? And the reason I pose them to you is because I actually work with a fair number of producers over a fairly long period of time, and so I know that the answer to that is not many of you really haven't thought about this, and no, you probably haven't adopted the Secure Beef Supply Plan. In fact, some of you who have learned something about it probably have pretty deeply founded reasons to not want to respond to that, and I really think you need to rethink the entire equation. And that's what I'm hoping to do here, right? So what are the barriers to adopting biosecurity best practices? Because basically what we need to do to work with foot and mouth disease is going to be what we call biosecurity. I told you I work with a lot of infectious diseases over time, things like Johne's disease, bovine leukemia virus, BVD. And the way we actually prevent those things is not by vaccinating things. In fact, for 2 of them, there are no vaccines. The way we work with them is with biosecurity. And I will tell you just flat out that across the entire cattle industries, I don't care if this is cow-calf, feedlot, dairy, we are abysmal at applying biosecurity. And if you doubt that, ask yourself the question, the last time you bought cattle, how many of you in this room thoughtfully questioned whether you were about to introduce disease? How many of you tested anything from the animals coming in? How many of you consulted with a veterinarian before making the purchase? How many of you asked the question of the seller? So, do you have Johne's disease in your herd? Because I know the answer to these questions because I've worked in the cattle industries for like many years. We don't do that. If we can't do that with simple diseases that are endemic to the United States that affect your operation on every day, then I have news for you. We are woefully ill-prepared to deal with foot and mouth disease, which is that times 10. Okay? So I'm not asking you to do that times 10. What I'm asking you to do is to think about what your role is when foot and mouth disease hits. Because I will tell you that the probabilities that foot and mouth disease will hit the United States sometime in most of your lifetimes is high. And I will try and explain to you here why that is true. I can't tell you when it's going to hit, and I hope it doesn't occur tomorrow. I hope maybe we've prepared a little better before that, okay? So, because these things are true, and because I work with producers, and because I work with infectious diseases, a few years ago, I said, you know, Frank, you're a dope. You don't do anything about foot and mouth disease. You're as bad as everybody else. You're not dealing with one of the significant problems. You should probably think about this. And so I gathered a bunch of the leading beef producers in Colorado, not across the country. I work in my own state. I know a lot of these people, some of the regulatory officials, some of the educators, and I asked them to discuss with me for 2 hours these questions. What creates the need to know about preparedness? What motivates preparedness? What needs to be in place to increase knowledge and motivation? And do we wait for an incursion of foot and mouth disease to figure out the problem? And I got a lot of responses. I stimulated, I was very pleased with this. And so I got a lot of feedback from people. And here, boiled down to these 6 areas, became the things that basically came out of that conversation. So the problem here with foot and mouth disease preparedness is that this is a systems problem. There is no one of those things that actually is the reason why we don't do anything. It's human nature things as we respond to big systems where all those things sort of interact with one another. And I want to give you a little example of it, and it's actually where my research has gone recently. So I now have a funded project that I'm doing in Colorado. I'll share a little of it at the end if I have the time to do that, to sort of give you some idea of what I think we need to do in the future to improve, not just on this, but on some of the other things that come your way that producers are very resistant to change for, but that actually would serve you really, really well. I enjoyed hearing from your ag commissioner and his enthusiasm for a lot of the things that are going on with ag and his focus on the marketing, because a lot of the technologies and the changes and the tools available to you now could be really instrumental in improving the livelihoods of the animals, of the people, of the marketability of the product, and so on. And a lot of that has to do with these types of issues. So what they were able to identify for me was things like economic factors. Economic factors, this back to the question, what prevents people, or alternatively, what could we change to get people to be prepared for things like foot and mouth disease? Or even closer to home, things like BVD or bovine leukemia virus or other types of diseases, right? So some of them identified economic factors. When I say economics, meaning the cost of doing something for it, the time it takes, the materials, they identified some social factors, tradition, norms, and the question of whether your neighbors or other operations do similar things, that people take cues from one another, and if so-and-so isn't doing it, well, geez, I probably shouldn't do it either. Or alternatively, yeah, it doesn't matter what I do, because when those yeehaws over there aren't doing anything, I'm still going to get hosed. So one way or the other, it's a problem. Policy factors, government and industry policies that support preparedness. Knowledge factors, more education and awareness is needed. Motivational factors, is it important? And then technology factors. So I'm just going to go back up through that list a little bit and give you some food for thought on why I consider this a systems problem. What I understand from having talked with some of the industry leaders in my state, what is it? What stops this? What stops that? And this was sort of the list that they came up with. This is what we call social sciences research. It's not my native turf, but I have the pleasure of working at a university where I can tap on all these resources of people who never think a minute in their life about ag, but they got skills. And if I can drag them into my arena, then they use those skills to help me out as we work with problems, okay? So let's look at the technology factors. I just went to one of the booths out here in the trade show and asked, so how many people in Kentucky are using EID? And the answer, of course, is, well, gradually a little bit more. What a wonderful tool. And if foot and mouth disease does hit, the ability to identify really quickly where animals have gone in the United States could make a giant difference in identifying where it could have spread before we actually do the testing. But nobody uses EID. Although it's actually one of the best tools you could ever use for tracking performance of individual animals, making marketing decisions, making genetics and breeding decisions, it's a great tool. So there's just one example, okay? Motivation factors. Is this disease important? Is it important to be prepared? I'm willing to guess that whether you do or do not know a lot about foot and mouth disease, somewhere inside you're going to say, yes, it's important. The problem is it's not urgent. It's not urgent because it's a theoretical disease. This disease has not occurred in the United States of America since 1929, which exceeds the lifespan of almost everybody in this room. In fact, looking around, I'm thinking everybody in this room, which means it doesn't occur. Which means of all the things you do in your busy day, the last thing you're going to do is worry about a disease that doesn't occur. But now think what that does. It says, now I'm woefully ill-prepared because I know it's important, but it's not urgent. That's somebody else's problem. And now the onus goes to the government regulatory agents. So when it does occur, now you're in a position where you're going to say, yeah, those idiots let it into the country, as though that's going to do any good. That's like bitching out people because they weren't prepared for a wildfire. If the wildfire's occurring, I think we got a real problem here. And it's not time to be finding fault with what somebody did. It's time to take action. But if you're not prepared, you can't do that. And so instead, we blame somebody else for their failure to do something that we actually were unwilling to do ourselves. So you see how these are social issues? These are basically boiling down to human behavior. Unless I am misunderstood, I'm not suggesting this is, beef producers need to get their poop in a group. These are human nature things. I do exactly the same stuff. When we get to the thing about policy factors, government, 25 years ago, I had this little piece of property, and I decided I was going to build a cabin. And I'm a woodworker, so I wasn't going to put up any cabin. I'm going to put up a timber frame. Many of you know the great barn that's made of timber frame. Oh man, I'm making a timber frame. This is a labor of love. This took me some years. But along the way, I had to deal with the county approval process. And the county approval process says, Frank, you're going to have to cut some trees down here. And I responded just the way most of the people in this room would respond. What are these people doing? I mean, what do you think? I don't know what the heck I'm doing. This is my business. This is not your business. What are you telling me what to do? But of course I didn't say that. I was very polite to the guy that came, and I said, so wait a minute. You're going to tell me to cut my trees down? Why do you think I put the cabin here to begin with? I mean, I kind of like these trees. And the guy actually responded to me in a very sanguine way. Rather than getting upset, he said to me, Frank, I don't think you understand. Although I don't want your cabin to burn, it's not you I'm protecting. Who I'm protecting here is all the people who will suffer from the forest fire that occurs when you make a mistake and your cabin burns down. Then you hurt everybody else. My job as a regulator is to make sure that your actions don't hurt somebody else. If you want to hurt yourself, that's your business. And I got to thinking about it, and I said, what a great analogy to so many of the things that I work with. The issue is not just whether you get foot and mouth disease, it's whether somebody gets foot and mouth disease that impedes beef trade and all of the things that go on that support the livelihoods of every single person in this room. And the regulators, you see, they're just those poor people that have to make decisions about how to do this because they're as dedicated to the industry as you are. They don't want bad outcomes. They're not there to tell you what to do because they're jerks. They're there to tell you what to do because their job is to protect the greater good of the rest of the beef industry. And so they're going to make rules, and they're going to tell you how to apply them. So our problem here is that we have the regulators over here trying to do their job well, and we have the producers over here doing what I did with my cabin. I did build the cabin. I did cut the trees down. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that, I had to cut a lot more trees than that, damn it. I'm going to protect this darn cabin because I've done too much work on it. 22 years later, some bozo 40 miles away had a campfire. The campfire started the single biggest forest fire in Colorado history. The winds blew 80 miles an hour. It did not matter that I had my trees cut down because with that intensity, the temperature of those flames exceeded 2,200 degrees. And my poor cabin sat right there, standing up off the hillside, and it burnt to nothing. And so he was right. We had to do some things to mitigate. Things still go wrong. Somebody else's actions are going to affect you. And the only way we actually make progress in this is to actually thoughtfully figure out how to work together to decrease the risk. Does that make sense to everybody? That, in essence, is what I think you folks should do. And to the degree that I can help you think about that in a way that says, maybe there are some better actions we could take. And maybe it doesn't have to be high cost. Maybe it's just a matter of preparing. And so I'm going to try and walk you through a little bit of the process of what the information is that would help you, okay? And what I'm going through for my part is see if I can populate some of those things with some of the data that I can use to actually share with other people and change a little bit the way USDA responds, a little bit the way state vets respond, and a little bit the way producers respond so that potentially we can work together in a more effective fashion than we have to date. So with all those things said, let's talk a little about what foot and mouth disease is. Foot and mouth disease is a foreign animal disease. By definition, that doesn't mean it's crazier, weirder than any other infectious disease we work with. It means that it doesn't occur in this country, which is a really good godsend because this has some very specific characteristics, all right? The entire US population is naive to this virus. The fact that it doesn't occur here means that there is no background immunity. And so the first question many people ask me, a lot of people will say, well, yeah, I don't get it. We should just vaccinate, right? Because that's the knee-jerk response. Don't ask me to do something. Why don't you guys just go vaccinate? And then if everybody's vaccinated, we won't have to worry about this anymore. I'm going to explain to you later why there is no way in the world we're going to go out and just vaccinate the U.S. cattle population. What we're going to do is try and keep it off our shores, and to the degree that we can accomplish that, we save a lot of time, trouble, energy problems, trade, and so on. So we're not going to vaccinate. We have changed the attitude towards vaccination in the face of an actual incursion, but we're not going to vaccinate to prevent its entrance into the U.S. And there's a bunch of reasons, and I'm going to go over them later, okay? So foot and mouth disease is notable because it is known as either the most or one of the most contagious diseases on Earth. It means that it transfers from animal to animal really, really easily. And I'm going to show you a little of the reasons why that's true. And so that makes it really scary, because when it does occur, it's extremely easy for this virus to move from one place to another, which is why it really requires that we're prepared, because when we identify it, if we can do the right things at that time, and if we are prepared to do the right things, it's not the things we do now, it's the things we're prepared to do then that will potentially mitigate its spread and allow us to eliminate the disease again and make it again into a foreign animal disease. That's the target, that's the goal. And I hope you will see why that is the goal, okay? It's a high morbidity, low mortality disease. The reason this disease is scary is not because it kills everything in sight. It doesn't. When this moves into a population, there are countries that are endemic with this disease. The average mortality in adult animals is somewhere in the 1% to 3% range. You deal with a lot of diseases that have a much higher mortality than that. That's not what makes this scary, unless you're a baby calf. If you're a baby calf, then this disease is lethal probably 20, 30% of the time. So little babies take it in the shorts. But the way the disease manifests, which is shown in some of these pictures, is it erodes a bunch of surfaces in very sensitive tissues. Now you imagine that this animal with a high fever, with tongue lesions like that, anybody here ever had cold sores, and you know how you kind of change your chewing behavior? Well, these cows will probably not eat for 4, 5, 6, 8 days, which means they don't make milk. And their teats get eroded, which means they don't want calves nursing, which means that baby calves, if they don't die from myocarditis, sure as heck don't do well, okay? And then eventually they recover. A week to 2 weeks, animals will blow all this off, just like your cold sores. So it's not a lethal disease. It's a production limiter. If this occurs in the United States and we allow it to become endemic, then you will forever suffer through the consequences of a disease that keeps cycling through and, without killing an awful lot of animals, makes it remarkably hard to produce. Where the disease occurs, they don't have production anywhere even closely approximating what we can do in the United States. And one of the reasons for that is because of foot and mouth disease, okay? So that's what the disease does. Furthermore, it affects virtually all cloven-hoofed domestic animals, as well as virtually all cloven-hoof wild animals. There are some that it affects more significantly, and some that it affects less. So I show you the pig snout over on the right-hand side there. Pigs, it really hammers. I mean, it'll actually take their toes off. So those just have to be destroyed. Others are less significantly affected. The most common animal that it affects, actually, the one that carries it the best, is the Cape buffalo. Cape buffalo from Africa. But the main carrier of this disease is cattle. That's who actually transfers it in most settings where it occurs. There are carriers in this disease. So this is a particularly big deal, because it means that when infection occurs, it also means that some animals that will be affected will recover and then carry it and shed it for 2 months, 6 months, in cattle, potentially as much as 3.5 years. So you can't just let it go through a herd and then say, okay, we're good now, because it's probably still there. And it means that if you just leave that herd alone or begin to trade with them. So what do you think we're going to do with a herd that's infected with this virus? We're going to, at some level, kill every single animal in that operation, because it's the only way to stop the virus from spreading to other operations. We can't just assume that it won't. And if it continues to be here, then it becomes an endemic threat. And then we have that problem. So the rules that have been written recognize these features, all right? Cape buffalo are the worst. The other animals will carry it at some level. All of the different species respond a little bit differently to this virus. But suffice to say that this won't just be a cattle problem. So pig producers need to be worried about this too, okay? Furthermore, because of the way this disease works, and part of the way that it spreads so easily is, one, that it's easy for an animal to contract it. Two, it's easy for the virus to move. But third is because prior to the time the animal shows clinical signs, it will be shedding the virus at very high levels, infecting other animals before you ever knew that the disease was actually present. And so in some cases, saliva has been documented to be excreted 10 days before the appearance of clinical signs. Clinical signs will appear after an infection, what we call the incubation period, for somewhere between 2 and 14 days. In other words, if it actually occurred in an animal on your operation, it could be 2 weeks before you know that the animal is sick. Then there's going to be another period of time, and if you've traded any animals, or if you've walked off the operation, or if you've worked with other animals, you just spread it to wherever else it was going, okay? Furthermore, it's a pretty robust virus. There are some infectious agents we work with that don't do well in the environment. I'll give you a good example. In the dairy industry, it would be mycoplasma. It has to be shed, it has to be picked up by the next animal within a relatively short time, like a few minutes of when it gets out of one animal to the next, because it doesn't live in the environment very well. It suffers, it perishes. This virus is perfectly happy to exist on wool for 2 weeks, on hair for 4 to 6 weeks. In fact, although this is not a human pathogen, it is easy for people to pick the virus up while they're breathing in the air, and it will live in your oral pharynx without causing disease for as much as 48 hours. So if you were on one operation that had it, and you then moved to the next operation, you could potentially breathe this virus into the place. It's been noted to travel as much as 20 kilometers on land, over land. We don't deal with viruses that spread like that. Remember the COVID thing? The COVID is an RNA virus too. Remember they told you to stand 6 feet away from the people in front of you? Yeah, right. You'd have to stand 20 kilometers from whoever it is to be sure you didn't spread it. And if it's moist, then it's going to spread more easily, okay? It's not that hard to kill it, actually. If you look at cooked meat, it would be common to do that. But how many of you seriously actually cook your meat product to 158 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes? Like, not many. We can kill it with changes in pH. Most meat products, we're making sausages or something like that, we reduce the pH below 6. But now let me give you a postulate. You travel with your spouse because things are going pretty well, and the cattle industry this year did really well, and you say, hey, we're going to Kenya for a safari. And so now you come back from Kenya, or Uganda, or name the other place that has endemic foot and mouth disease. And you didn't see any sick animals, and so it didn't seem like a problem. But you went to the market where they actually have live animals all over the place, and now it's on your pants. And so you bring it home, and you go feed your cows. And how's that going to get picked up by the Border Patrol, the customs agents? They won't. They'll just ask you, have you been on livestock operations? We'd really appreciate it if you clean your clothes. They're not going to pull you off to the side and hose you down with acetic acid. So when you travel, it's possible to bring this. What about other tourists that potentially come in? What if the meat product didn't sink down below 6 pH because of some error in how it was produced? Then we potentially introduce it that way. And then it gets fed to the dog, and then the dog poops, and then it gets exposed to the cows, and then we spread it that way. You see, the reason I said I think it's likely to occur is because over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've increased the amount of traffic of humans and things and goods and everything else everywhere. And I don't care how good our biosecurity practice is, in complex systems, something goes wrong eventually. And even if everybody in the customs just does their job top drawer, which is pretty unlikely, even if they did that, sooner or later, something just goofs up. For my cabin, it was the bozo that didn't control the campfire. Now, that person wasn't out to get me. That person just made a stupid mistake, and a whole bunch of people paid the price. That's just the way these things happen. So, they're doing a good job. It's pretty amazing to me we have not gotten it earlier than this. But our luck's only going to hold out for so long. And so if we don't have a good plan and good preparedness, then we've got a problem. This is a map that shows the dark green are countries that are free without vaccination. The red, of course, is where it's endemic. And so this brings up a really central point that I'm going to come back to in terms of the costs, the losses. You'll notice we don't export much beef to Ethiopia, but we do export beef to a bunch of the countries in Europe, to Mexico, to Canada, to Indonesia, to Japan, to Korea. And they don't want this virus either. So when we get this virus, what is their first response going to be? It's going to be, we don't want your products anymore. That's a big deal. And that's why the regulatory authorities, in trying to protect the industry, are going to have some very strict and very difficult, strict policies and difficult decisions to make, because they're going to want to try and stop this, okay? So now, we would look at this, because of the potential for this, as an all hazards emergency, which means we're going to use a system that's going to try to work with it. It's a highly contagious viral infection. It's not a food safety threat, but in terms of the losses that the industry likely would incur, it's going to cause the animal disease losses. Those are the showstopper in endemic areas. We don't want that to happen. And so instead, we're going to look at, and nobody else wants that to happen, so they're going to put up international trade barriers. The stoutest trade barriers in the world are predicated on health issues. If a country can plausibly say, accepting these goods is a threat to human or animal health, that is the strongest obstruction of trade that you can create. And it's defended by the World Court every time. All right? So when they say, we don't want your beef, we can't strong arm them into taking beef. They're just going to say, no, I don't want to take that risk. All right? So I want to show you a little of what international trade does for the U.S. beef industry, so that you have some sense of what that is. And then there will be the eradication efforts. The eradication efforts, which are going to be pretty stringent, are going to be another loss. And part of the reason we've developed different plans is because in the UK, when they tried what we called stamping out meant that if you had an affected operation here, you plausibly assumed that all the operations in the same area probably also had it, and you started killing cattle like there was no tomorrow. People committed suicide. They had these giant pyres burning. This is in the 2001 UK outbreak, because they went totally overboard trying to control this. In the aftermath of that, the United States realized that, whoa, that's probably not the best plan. In 1929, when we eliminated it last time, we actually did exactly the same thing. As a vet student 45 plus years ago, they actually still had high-8 tapes that showed the people and the eradication effort. And they took cattle throughout the counties that were involved, and they took all the cattle and they put them in these big trenches dug with these big machines, and guys with black rubber coats that they could totally sanitize shot every single one and then buried them with a bulldozer. And you know what they did with all the deer in those areas? They got all of the populace out and they drove all the deer down the ravines, and then they shot every single one in those counties. Does anybody in this room think that anybody in the United States of America is going to allow that to happen again? Because I think the likelihood is very small. And in fact, we would stir such negative emotion amongst our consumers that I don't think we would ever regain their trust again. All right? So this is a problem. The losses are likely to be substantial. To put some data behind that, this is actually a graph that shows U.S. export volume, which was the years preceding 2003. And do you guys remember the cow that stole Christmas? This is December 23rd, 2003. Everybody here knows that. And look what happened with trade. We built it up just before that. The industry was so proud of itself, man, we are really sending some beef overseas. And the more beef we send overseas, the higher the price goes, because you got a supply-demand thing here. And if you can increase demand someplace else, prices do this. And so everybody was happy until that one singular cow. And then we lost confidence from our primary high-end trading partners. Not everybody did this, but Japan did, Korea did. And we dropped down to the lowest export that we'd had in the previous 20 years. It took us 10 years to get back to gaining their confidence back again. That's what that graph shows you, okay? And this is what that represents in dollars. If you start on the left, that's 2004. There's only $30 per head value in the export market. This last year is 411. So when we have a fed steer and we're sending it to slaughter, and what are they going for now? $1.85, $2, something like that, going to slaughter for a 1,500-pound steer, $3,000. A full sixth of that value across all steers in the United States is predicated on the export value. It's not that we export all that much, but what we export stimulates the price to a degree. You stop that, we get foot and mouth disease tomorrow, that will sink to close to zero. That's a lot of money, okay? And then there's going to be the public response. The public response, this was actually a cartoon that was derived, I think it was maybe 2010 or something like that when I did the clipping on this. I forget exactly when it was, but it was how the public responds, the actual danger versus the fear, panic, hype, misinformation, overreaction, and hysteria. Because not everybody in the public is going to understand when we start killing cows that this isn't a human disease. And there's going to be some suspicion that there's some problem here. And maybe I shouldn't buy beef anymore. So pork and poultry are going to do this, and cattle are going to do that. You do know this, right? And this is a graph of consumer confidence from March 2010, which was after those effects, and shows the rise in consumer confidence. But I'm very confident that that would retreat again in the face of something where we are inordinately panicked about what we're doing and if we overreact to this disease. So if you're going to have a reasonable response, we have to have a well thought out process. That's the point. So let's talk about control. Will the public tolerate mass slaughter and or incineration of carcasses? How will carcasses be disposed of? We have feedlots in Colorado. I know you guys have some feedlots. My understanding, I could be wrong, is there 500, 1,000, maybe 1,500 head would be very common. Where I am, 80,000, 100,000 head. Has anybody ever actually thought of the logistics of killing 100,000 head of cattle in a very short period of time? This is a challenge, and how we go about doing it will be difficult. What happens if foot and mouth disease gets into deer, feral pigs, other wildlife? So obviously, why not vaccinate? So now I'm back to the question I gave you before. There are reasons we don't vaccinate. There are 7 distinct serotypes. A serotype, when you see that term, a serotype means the serum response of the animal. That's the animal's ability to recognize the infection. It sees foot and mouth disease as 7 different bugs. So we'd have to vaccinate against all of those bugs. Furthermore, it's much like COVID. It's an RNA virus, which COVID is also an RNA virus. And you notice how many times we have to redo the vaccine for COVID? Those of you who actually do get the vaccine? We like every 6 months or so, we're redoing the vaccine. You know how many times we redo the flu vaccine? We redo the flu vaccine every year. Why? Because the genetic drift in what those viruses are doing means you have to have a new vaccine each time. Furthermore, the immunity only lasts about 6 months for a killed product. But because they revert, because they are very malleable viruses that are changing on their own, you not only have 7 completely different viruses as the animal sees it, but they also change over time. And if we create a modified live vaccine, which has been tried, we do try these things. And you know what happens? Eventually, the genetic drift makes them infectious again. And so now we've actually created the disease within our shores. So we don't like that idea, and so we are intending to use killed products. Killed products only last about 6 months. The vaccinated animals have to be then permanently identified, because when we go to trade them, as long as we're vaccinating, our trading partners test those animals, and it looks like they had the virus. Therefore, as long as you're vaccinating, our primary trading partners are going to refuse to accept our product. Do you begin to understand why we don't vaccinate against this problem? And then let's take it the next step. Yeah, you have to differentiate between them, but we also then potentially have the problem of who's going to actually do all that work and vaccinate. If it's got to be vaccinated every 6 months. So show of hands, no, I'm kidding, that's a rhetorical question. How many of you in the room gather your animals or are willing to gather your animals every 6 months just to vaccinate them for foot and mouth disease? And who's going to pay for that? You? Because do you think the public wants to pay for this? So we do have an emergency vaccine bank. It's a really critical tool. In the event that we do get foot and mouth disease, the intent is that we will use it to vaccinate in the proximity of where the infected animals were, and that we're going to vaccinate like crazy if we can there to see if we can mitigate the spread of the virus outside of that ring. And if we can do that, then we could control it quicker. But you know what's going to happen with every one of those animals that gets vaccinated? Every single one of them has to go to slaughter, because we can't afford to have animals in the system. So they might not have to go to slaughter today, but they are not going to be your long-term genetics. So think of what that does in the industry. Is this making sense to all of you? And notice, please, I hope, my point here is not to make you scared. I hate fear as a stimulus for anything. I like to make you aware. These are manageable issues. We can do this. This is not something to be afraid of. This is something to be prepared for. A wildfire is similarly scary, but if you are prepared for a wildfire, you can mitigate the potential problems that might occur. So there's really very little. People respond to fear. In the political arena, people use fear all the time because it induces really strong responses, most of which are irrational and the ones that the person who instilled the fear wanted you to believe. But I don't believe in that. I think the smart thing is to say, wow, this is like a pretty complex problem. Maybe we ought to think about this a little bit, all right? That's my goal. And so I get back to this, the reason I have those little circles in the top. That's the standard all hazards response. Mitigation, we start over on the right. Prepare, respond, recover, mitigate. Mitigate what the problems were. And that's a cycle. And over the last 30 years, we've developed a pretty formulaic approach to all hazards types of things. We've created systems. That's what FEMA is all about. And what FEMA is about is having an organized, regimented process that says, aha, problem. Therefore, we get an incident command group. Therefore, these people are in charge. Therefore, these people do this and this and this. And it has to be practiced. It has to be drilled. And so we have a whole system that we go through, all right? And the reason we're doing that is because the old thing of waiting till something happens and then just, oh, geez, I guess what do we do now? We learned from the UK. And when that 2001 problem occurred, we said, whoa, it devastated the industry. It hammered the industry. The industry will probably never respond. We cut out genetics that can never exist again. And we don't want that to happen in the United States. And so we've developed other things. We have this emergency disaster response. It's got federal, state, and local coordination. The USDA and the states have exercised and refined what they call the Red Book, which establishes, if it occurs, then we're going to do these things first, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that. And I'm going to walk you briefly through what that process looks like. But it's very well regimented, okay? Here's the problem. It's the same one I told you about the county agent, you know, the county inspector coming and checking my cabin. Then there's me, the guy who's actually supposed to be doing some of these things, but I don't know what that response is. And now somebody comes and tells me what to do. And the more detailed they get, the more aggravating it is. And so we have this problem where we resent the notion that the federal and the state governments are going to tell us what to do, when in fact they're the best friends we got, but we have this division because it's just antagonistic to have these people telling you what to do, all right? And especially when it comes down to, no, you need to do it this way and that way and this way. And so what they did is they created a thing called the Secure Beef Supply Plan, which if producers follow those rules and they're in a control zone, they get to at some level control their destiny. They get to maintain trade. They get to actually be able to move things because they can document that they are prepared to not spread or introduce the virus further. And so there's a bunch of rules that got laid out. Unfortunately, that was made mostly by federal and state agencies and industry people, and not you either. And so it probably has the same overtone as anything that the state and the Fed regulators are going to do, all right? Can you tell that I'm kind of sensitive to the regulator people? It's because I work a lot with the state vet and I work a lot with the feds, and I actually think they're really good people, and I think I love the fact that they're so dedicated to the industry, and it really bums me out that so many people are like, stupid state vet told me what to. So yeah, I kind of defend them a little bit because I should, because they're actually on our side. And so they've worked out these hierarchies of things. Here's just an example. It's a high-level view. Heightened alert phase is if foot and mouth disease occurs in Canada or Mexico, but not the US. Phase 1 is from the first confirmation of a case in the US, what we do then. And what that is, by the way, is most likely to be a 72-hour standstill of all animal and feed traffic in the United States of America. End story. Remember after 9/11 and the planes all got grounded? All right, that was for human movement. Think of what this looks like at the animal movement level. You can't go move manure, you can't go move feed, you can't introduce things onto that. They want all traffic to stop for 72 hours. Why? Because they need to figure out where the heck it went. Which is why EID is so cool, because then they could say, oh yeah, well, here's the records, and these animals went over there, and this herd was infected, but 2 days ago they moved animals here, and then those moved to these people, which would be pretty helpful. But in the meantime, they're just going to do the best they can. They're going to try and figure out where the virus is, and then they're going to try and put quarantines on those places where they have a highest likelihood, and they figure that in 72 hours they've got a reasonable chance, and they don't think they can stop it longer than that. But after that, what traffic is going to increase is going to be totally dependent on where they find it, okay? But then we have surveillance, and then we have recovery. So in other words, this is all detailed in this very massive book. And they even have looked at what the level of infection is. If it's a focal, oh, this is what just happened in Germany, or it looks like it's what's happened in Germany. Germany hasn't had foot and mouth disease in quite a while either. And I don't know if you paid attention to the news, but I think it was 5 days ago, 6 days ago, they identified a foot and mouth disease case in a Cape Buffalo in Germany. And so they did exactly what we're talking about here. It looks, I haven't read the full report yet, and I don't really know, it looks as though it was in a pretty singular operation in one place, and because it was Cape Buffalo, they don't trade a lot like you guys do, and so it seems as though they may be able to contain it with very little trouble and get rid of it really quickly. That's what it looks like. I don't know if that's true. That's only a few days ago, okay? So we're going to have these strict control of animals and products, regulation of garbage feeders, strict on farm biosecurity, rapid reporting of suspects, and if an outbreak occurs, we need immediate slaughter of infected and contact animals, or kill them on site and bury them. Okay, if we can't get them to a slaughter plant, we want to get rid of all of the animals that are infected. And from what I told you before, by the time it's recognized on that operation, there is a reasonable chance that virtually every single animal in that operation has the virus. So this isn't a joke. And you're not going to wait to see who gets sick. You're basically going to say, the sooner we get rid of the problem, the happier everybody is. So if that's you, you're not very happy. But if it's the rest of the cattle industry, everybody's shouting, cheering, okay? So that's the type of thing we'll do. And here's with a little more detail, not an exquisite detail, what the FMD response plan looks like. First, we're going to quarantine infected premises. So every place that they think they've found it, basically that operation is at some level doomed because we know the virus is there. And they're going to have to do something radical to get rid of that virus. And it stays in the environment, and the cattle are carriers. And so they're going to have to make some tough calls. But unfortunately, those people are going to pay a big price, okay? But then we're going to see if we can ID this strain. We're going to we'll consider our vaccine supply. We're going to look if we have a cross-match against it. My state vet told me, I believe this is accurate, I don't know in Kentucky, that if an outbreak occurred in the western states, she anticipated that she might be given 100 to 150,000 vaccines, which in my state means we could vaccinate one whole feedlot, which isn't what we will do, right? We'll channel the animals through the feedlot. But that means that our ring vaccination, our ring of protection is going to be very limited, which is one of the projects that I've worked on. Vaccinate all cattle twice so that we can within a particular zone. We don't have enough vaccine to do it right away. By the time they ramp that up, that's probably a 2-week time frame. By the time the animals are immune, that's probably about a 2-week time frame. And so we're talking about what would look like a delayed response, but it's probably the best we can do, okay? And then we'll have to put in a barrier system. We'll have to decontaminate decontamination system for workers, traffic on and off operations, and so on. Transport without disease spread and decontaminate packing plants. So the idea would be, rather than doing what the UK did and just killing everything, we will try to harvest them. And we'll try to communicate with the public that says this is not a public health threat. And if we can keep things at a reason, guess who has to cooperate for all that to work? Like you guys. Otherwise, it's mayhem. In wildfire outbreaks where we have a similar, very regulated system of first responders, if the people in the community, so you see you have this problem, you have the regulators over here who've practiced and they know what they're doing and they got a system and they got a plan and they've got a regiment and they're pretty well figured out. And then we have everybody else over here. And so in wildfire zones, and I've just recently lived through a couple of these, if these people go haywire and say, well, that doesn't really apply to me. What if when my cabin wasn't threatened, I had gone in to say, oh, but I wasn't prepared and I left some of my most favorite personal memorabilia in my little cabin and I'm going to go retrieve them. And then the 80-mile-an-hour wind comes. And now what happens? The first responders who have this strong savior gene are going to try and save my sorry butt, and then we're all going to burn to death. All right? That's why cooperation between this sector and this sector becomes really important, because these people can't operate without help from these people. And so we have a problem here, a systems problem, because most of these people are not dialed in. And it doesn't mean you got to do a lot of stuff. It means we have to communicate. It means we got to do better than we're doing now, okay? And that's what created the Secure Beef Supply Plan. This is a little more detailed than I wish it was, but I really think it's worth every producer reading it and seeing why those things were put in place. This was designed to be something that producers would adopt and then be prepared in the event something happened. It's not highly costly, but it's tedious, and it takes time, and it's annoying. Okay? And so they made it pretty detailed. National Premises ID, the things all make sense. Writing an operations-specific enhanced biosecurity plan, developing contingency plans, keeping movement records of animals, people, environment, and preparing to monitor for FMD and be able to write. It's actually pretty simple if you keep it simple. But it's about 8 pages, and so it looks really dense. And so when we try to educate people, we fail. Okay? And one of my favorite quotes, Dwight Eisenhower said, "Plans are worthless. Planning is everything." My own personal viewpoint, it's not whether you adopt the Secure Beef Supply Plan, because that will change over time too. It's the fact that you're engaged in the planning process. It means that you understand what's going to happen. It means that you're prepared for what other people are going to be telling you. It means you have some kind of a notion. So when the wildfire took my cabin, I actually had a plan. One, I didn't have my most valuable personal belongings in my cabin, and I did not choose to go and get burned to death, and therefore I did not endanger the first responders, and I was a really sad guy. But I was prepared. And I didn't have to do a lot. I just had to pay attention, okay? So that's really what I had to share. I think I have a couple minutes, so I'm going to just zoom through this just so you see the types of things, because I think it might be useful to you anyway. And when Carrie first heard me present, I showed a couple of these graphs, and she said, "That's really cool." So this is for Carrie. That we've done a couple of things, and the first one was my state vet a few years back, 3 years ago, 4, something like that, said, "Frank, I really need your help. We need a disease spread model to help guide a response." And I was like, really? And then I thought it through. See, she will be that person who's in the gun sights like the poor people who had to decide whether to close the schools in the face of COVID. No matter what decision she makes, somebody is out to get her butt, because somebody's going to be really unhappy. But they have to make the best decision they can with a limited amount of information, so the more information they have, the better they can make a decision and justify it. In the face of COVID, unfortunately, we didn't have any information at all. We didn't know if the kids were going to spread it and make it worse. We didn't know if teachers were going to die, and so they made a hard call. And that's the type of thing where I go, you know, I'm not sure it was the best decision, but it was the best decision they could make at the time, and I am the last one who's going to criticize them, because boy, am I glad it wasn't me making that call. So when my state vet makes a decision on who to vaccinate, I'd rather be in the shoes of saying, I did the best I could to give her the best information so she could make the best call she can. So she wanted us to do some modeling. And so I should have told you one other thing there. Along the way, I got in touch with all of our surrounding states. I said, hey, you guys want to participate in this modeling project? Because, you know, this might be pretty cool. And everybody said, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Wow, that's cool, man. And I have these people I work with that are modelers. I can't do this at all. I'm like totally clueless. But those people are really good. And they said, and so the state vets said, yeah. They said, but you know the bigger problem? The bigger problem, Frank, is whatever modeling we have. If the producers don't cooperate with us, it's going to be mayhem and we're hosed anyway. And I said, that's a good point. That's why I'm doing what I do now, okay? And so we have these models that are based on shipment data and things, and so some of these models pre-exist. And so when we look at the number of animals that move, and we have background data on how animals traffic in the United States and between counties and who moves what where, and we can get that data, that's what would be enhanced with EID. But we do have CVIs, Certificates of Veterinary Inspection. We do monitor what happens, and then we can create models that say, these animals move over here really frequently and they don't move very much over there, and this is much more sporadic. And then we can take that and do mathematical models to look at where they go, how it spreads. And then we can come up with graphs like this that can help the state vet and say, yeah, depending on where the outbreak starts. If it starts in Colorado, obviously it's our problem to begin with. But let's say it started in Kentucky, or let's say it started in Florida, or let's say it started in Kansas. Now we have models that show the frequency and then the county zones within Colorado where it would most likely end up, where we most likely need to be looking, where we most likely would deploy vaccination more effectively. So this will help her in making the decision. And we can update this at any given time. We also look at spatial visualizations to ask where it begins in the entire country. And remember I told you I don't like to make you afraid? If people respond well, and if we actually detect the virus quickly, and if the 72-hour shutdown is effective, and if we can effectively contain that there, most of our runs of scenarios, the median, actually shows very little spread. Because although it could spread wildly, in most cases it doesn't. I hope that's what happens in Germany, all right? I have some roots in Germany, and so I have a special spot in my heart for, oh my God, that's those poor guys, right? The upper 2.5% of cases looks like the bottom graph. And what that basically says is that the spread through those zones based on the trafficking of animals with normal predicted yearly types of distributions of critters, there it would be really big, and we would potentially have, you know, hundreds of thousands of animals infected. We can also do that with how long duration the virus would still be here. I hope you recognize that the sooner we can go from diseased status to disease-free status, the better our economy does, the better our producers do, and so the more rapidly we can respond, the better. And so the top is the median. In fact, we probably, with a little bit of luck, can control this virus, we hope, in as little as 24 to 36 days, which would be that'd be reasonable. Okay, we can deal with that. But the bottom graph shows what happens with the upper 2.5%. So what kind of stipulations do you think make the bottom two graphs on those cases more realistic? Lack of cooperation from producers who continue to spread the disease throughout the states, regardless of what the authorities told them to do. Right? So if we can work together as a team, we can have better potential efficacy, all right? And so my next project is dealing with what supports the implementation of biosecurity practices. And my critique is that right now, most of the efforts done in the United States, and being done for somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 years now, have been based on a notion that producers need education. The problem, you see, is you guys. You're not educated. You don't know. That's the problem. So if we now educate you about the Secure Beef Supply Plan, you'll all jump up and say, hair on fire, I got to take care of this. Which means, no, that's not going to happen. I've educated students for over 40 years. I can give them as much education as I want. What it takes is a shift in the way people use the education. So what I'm trying to do here is not educate you on what you need to do. It's to hopefully motivate you a little bit to think about the short time it would take you to understand, what is the plan? Could I adhere to that plan? If not, what could I do? Could I work with a state vet? Could I have a discussion as a state or as an organization and say, you know, we can't really do that, but we could sure as heck do this? Could we come to some agreements that potentiate a better response, okay? And in fact, the most recent survey of producers says 7% of producers, 12% of feedlots have adopted the SPS plan. In other words, it has almost no adoption in the United States. Great plan, no uptake. And as Eisenhower said, plans are worthless. It's planning that's everything. So if we could stimulate some more discussion. So what I'm hoping is, and furthermore, it's not simply a producer problem. So in the project that I'm trying to do, I don't know how successful I'll be, a little secret. Part of the great thing about being a professor is I can fail all day long. And you know what the result is? I get smarter. It means I get to go back again and, well, that didn't work, so I'll try this. No, I'll try that. And I never lose money. I just try something new all the time. It's part of why I love being a professor. I loved hearing your ag commissioner saying, I love this job. I love my job. Because I get to do some things that potentially help people. And when I fail, I just try something different, okay? What I hope I've shared with you here is this. And what I would like to say is that, as Albert Einstein says, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I do not think the answer to this problem is educating producers, and all of a sudden you guys are going to just jump up and do it. I think what you need to do is have a discussion amongst the producer groups, and ideally then with, I think that was, education's only useful if there's a need to use it. So what I'm hoping is that we can develop some interaction between the different sectors within the beef communities, show them what we learned from each of the different sectors, and hopefully develop a little bit better crosstalk about how we could actually work together to beat this. So that's what I had to present you. And left, almost 10 minutes to. Does anybody have questions? Yeah.
Hold on just a minute.
Feedlots, the cows were put down at night and they were fine. Woke up the next day, they were all leg up. And it was like all of them. Whatever happened there?
I'm not familiar with there was a giant death loss in feedlots in Kansas a couple years ago that was attributed to heat stress.
Well,
I don't know if that's the
heat
same
stress.
thing. What's that?
But you and I know that if we walk out in our lot and we go home that night and our cows are looking pretty good, and the next day they're all dead.
The people I talked with, if we're talking about the same episode, the people I talked with said it was heat stress. Frank, you have no idea what it was like there. Maybe the inaccuracy, I'm guessing, I'm thinking we're talking about the same episode.
Yeah, we are.
Was the notion that they were fine. They weren't fine. They were suffering through heat stress, and it accumulates in cattle because of the way their physiology operates and because of their body mass, and it ended up being more than they could stand. I've had that happen with some animals I've run through a chute. If they get totally stressed, they'll drive their temperature up and it'll hit 108, 109. I've only had this happen a couple times, but I've done research on long-fed steers, and man, I'll tell you, they get stressed really easy. And we left and the animal's sort of looking a little tough, but okay, and dies 6 hours later because all the tissues break down associated with the hyperthermia that occurred before. Maybe we're talking about different things, but that's my best understanding.
No, it was like 10,000 cattle.
Yeah, there were thousands of cattle.
It was thousands.
It was thousands.
Okay.
It was a really big deal. What we're hoping to do is change some of their heat mitigation strategies. I think we're talking about the same thing. Okay. I really do believe that was heat stress. And because of the humidity and the heat at that time, it accumulated too much, and they were still standing, but they weren't doing well. And then eventually it's hours later that level of hyperthermia just erodes their physiologic ability to maintain life, and then they just start dying like flies. And it might not even be hot anymore, but that's what happens.
Dr. Garry, I have one request over here. Slides, if you could back up to the map, the world map showing the countries circled.
Yeah.
And then I've got a question right here.
Yep,
that one there.
That guy.
Thank you.
Dr. Garry, considering our national preparedness right now for foot and mouth disease, can you give me an educated guess, and I know it'll be a guess, of the probability of this disease happening in the U.S., let's say in the next 10 years?
I I can't give you a guess of a probability, but when I talk with people in USDA, when I talk with the people that oversee these types of programs, we all have a shared conviction that sooner or later, something has to go wrong, something. And another one that I didn't discuss, because again, I'm not into fear responses, but there are a lot of my colleagues that actually think the reason it's going to come to the U.S. is because one of our enemies is going to figure out that this would be a damn good way to stop the U.S. economy. Poison the ag system. Because that type of thing would be so devastating to rural communities and to trade and to economies. And if you think 9/11 was a shocker, they bombed a couple buildings. You know, this would be potentially devastating across. So some people worry about agro-terrorism. That's, as you know, maybe FBI tracks these things. I have no idea. Have 5 attempts been made? Have no attempts been made? It would seem pretty easy to do. I try to not get people worried about that because that's not my focus. But in any complex system, sooner or later, just like the guy that burned the campfire, it could get introduced by innocent people that do something stupid because they just didn't know and it wasn't picked up because nobody communicated, and therefore now here it is. Actually, the last time it occurred in Canada, which was 1954, I think, if I remember right, it came in with a worker, a European worker, and he brought it in with him. And it didn't spread as far as it could have, but that was the last time I think it occurred in Canada. So that's 70 years ago or something like that. So I don't want to say 10% or 20%. I have no idea. I just figure we got the clock's ticking, and so it's sort of a Russian roulette thing. I just hope it isn't tomorrow, because I hope my colleagues and I are effective in getting people better prepared before it happens. Welcome. Was there another question? No. Well, I hope that was useful to you. If you could do something positive, I would strongly encourage you as an organization. You all belong to an organization where I think it's really worth having a really good discussion with your state veterinarian, with the regulators, with your committees, with the NCBA. And I'm not saying, I'm a George Patton advocate, okay? George Patton said, don't tell people how to do things. Tell them what needs to get done and let them surprise you with the results. And I believe that. I've practiced that almost all my life. When I work with producers, I don't tell them, no, you need to do it this way and this way. I say, here's what needs to happen. And then a lot of times they come up with a way better answer than I would have ever had, right? I'm just going to encourage you to discuss this more and learn a little bit more about it. And I really don't think looking into what is currently available is a big stretch for you.
Just real quick, if you
Yeah.
could answer this. Somebody had a question just about the difference between like foot and mouth disease or foot and mouth in children.
Oh, great question. I used to actually, I took that slide out. I actually had a slide that distinguished between foot and mouth disease of cattle and hand, foot, and mouth disease of children, which actually, remember my little goofy cartoon that I picked up out of the media about the fear, panic, and so on? Hand, foot, and mouth disease of children is a Coxsackie virus. It has no relationship whatsoever. It commonly goes through small child populations in the country. At any given time, someplace in the United States, there's a bunch of kids with these lesions in their mouth, and they're like bad cold sores, and it's not pleasant, and it's self-limiting, and it goes away. The best I know, there's no vaccine for it. It's not a giant health threat, but it has this really bad name because it's hand, foot, and mouth disease, and that sounds strikingly like foot and mouth disease. That's one of the problems we have with the public, right? People are going to only read the snippet, and it's going to sound the same, but they're not even closely related. And if you ask your public health people in whatever county you're in, they'll tell you, oh yeah, last time we had hand, foot, and mouth in kids, it was those kindergarten kids in such and such a place, and it just cycles around. But it's not a giant threat. And it's not foodborne. I believe it's just all contact. It's like getting, no, it's not even like getting the flu, because the flu kills people. The best I know, hand, foot, and mouth disease doesn't kill anything. Just makes you uncomfortable. It's like getting cold sores. That's my best analogy. Well, I thank you, folks. I hope that was useful to you. Appreciate your attendance.